Good day. I am Sebenzile Nkambule, the Executive Officer for Strategic Partnerships at the Other Foundation. The Other Foundation is an African philanthropic trust that does the work to advance and promote equality and freedom in Southern Africa, with a particular focus on sexual orientation and gender identity. We gather support to advance human rights and social inclusion for the LGBTI plus community in our region, and we do this by working as both a fundraiser and a grant maker. We work in 13 Southern African countries. The values that are the foundation of our organization are fairness, equality, and justice. We believe that everyone should be free to live a safe and a dignified life, have a family if they so choose, and make their contribution to society. The Other Foundation works to change the views and practices and institutions that prevent people because of who they are or who they love from being able to do that in Southern Africa. And we are pleased today to be participating in World Pride Copenhagen 2021. Corporates and businesses are key partners in the fight for the attainment of full citizenship of LGBTI plus Africans. We believe that it is through partnering with organizations such as our own and LGBTI activists that business-led change work can be done effectively. The potential of businesses to influence change, whether it's at a policy level, to shift and shape behavioral norms and attitudes, cannot be understated. LGBTI plus people are your clients, they're employees, and are key stakeholders in businesses. An underdeveloped approach to supporting these groups is not good for business, and it's not good for society broadly. As a region, we are at a tipping point to achieving significant change for LGBTI plus people. And partnering with businesses has the potential to tip us over and significantly change the realities of LGBTI plus people on our continent. This discussion in this town hall today aims to surface some of the issues in our context and show how the work we as the Other Foundation are part of leading alongside others can be game-changing with the right partners on board. I'm very pleased now to welcome our panelists. First is Farai Marubane. Farai is a director with the South African LGBTI plus Management Forum, who are an organization focusing on ensuring workplace inclusion and diversity of LGBTQI plus people in South African companies. We're also joined on our panel by Samuel Shapiro. Samuel is the former national organizer of Equal Education, the social justice campaign for equitable and good quality education in South Africa, and was previously Equal Education senior researcher. We also have Robert Akoto Amoafo. Robert is a human rights advocate, a communications expert, a personal and organizational development coach, and a certified trainer. He's also a gender and a sexual minority advocate. And then lastly, we'll be joined by Tamer Zikri, who is the global head of talent, diversity and inclusion at Intertrust Group.
South African Workplace Equality Index, or just SAWE for short, is our flagship project as the South African LGBT plus Management Forum. And so we launched this in 2018. And primarily because we spend majority of our waking day at work. Therefore, it's important that every employee, regardless of their diversity, should be treated equally by their co-workers and enjoy equal opportunities in their workplace as well. And so standards kind of need to be set, and greater accountability needs to be expected from our leaders within our workplaces. And regarding the SAWE project specifically, it provides companies in South Africa with a means to measure their levels of LGBTIQ plus inclusion against independently determined and research-based best practice. Because as we know, most companies in general, the more diverse companies are and the more inclusive workplaces are, the better producing, the better performing, and you get more kind of resilient companies from that. And so SAWE also sits alongside similar benchmarks internationally. There's one in the USA, there's one in the UK, Hong Kong, Australia, and Canada. And we're the only index that is running, this sort of research in the Middle East and Africa region. And the SAWE itself really aims to, firstly, to provide a practical, localized framework and a set of targets against which South African employers can measure themselves. And then secondly, we also aim to showcase and to celebrate the most LGBTIQ plus friendly employers in South Africa. And that's really to work around to help companies kind of with talent attraction and retention as well. And then thirdly, we aim to also create a healthy and competitive environment between employers and to create sort of more inclusive LGBTIQ plus friendly workplaces. Majority of the participants had some form of LGBTIQ plus network or resource group, or a lot of them had allies programs. And these networks are really active in what we've seen and engaging with their companies. And so another thing that companies can begin to introduce is, especially on a multinational basis, a lot of companies internationally have these affinity network groups or inclusion groups, making sure that they're present in the countries, so in smaller markets, so like South Africa, in smaller markets in the rest of Africa, and in smaller markets that are in developing countries as well, and to make sure that there's a mirror of those international groups and affinity networks that exist, to make sure that they're also in other markets as well. Diversity training and awareness continues to be a popular initiative. A lot of the companies that took part in the previous SAWE were training employees that were coming in as part of their induction around diversity training. And what we saw is that the greatest divergence in scores occurred with regards to inclusion of LGBTIQ plus people within employment equity forums. So with nearly sort of half explicitly excluding the LGBTQ plus representation and half of them not. And I think this is obviously directly tied to the policies and the laws at a national level in South Africa, is that companies are not required to include in their employment equity forums the LGBTIQ plus inclusion element. And so that's something that companies can always do, and companies can voluntarily include that within the EE forums. And then while most companies sort of had communications about LGBTIQ plus equality and inclusion within their region, only 16 out of the 27 participants could identify senior leaders that were LGBTIQ plus and out. And that's two elements. One of it is that that's not something that you can necessarily facilitate or force. If they aren't there, they aren't there. But on the other hand, I think it also speaks to the importance of having an environment that is conducive and safe for people to be out if they are there. So that speaks to really wider efforts that a company can be making to make people feel that they're safe and included within their workplace. And then finally, the evidence also highlighted some great work that a lot of companies are doing on diversity and inclusion in South Africa when it comes to LGBTIQ plus inclusion specifically, because it's not mandated legally in terms of requirements for a company to be considered inclusive or transformational, which is a word that we use in South Africa for inclusion around race and gender specifically, because companies aren't necessarily legally required to be including LGBTIQ plus inclusion efforts within their specific employee equity forums. It's important that LGBTIQ plus people in the workplace are included, and even when it's on a voluntary basis, and this can be done with existing programs. So existing programs that speak to diversity around gender, existing programs that speak to diversity around race, diversity around disability, and overall transformation efforts. It's important for companies to start thinking about how they're introducing, if it's not already there, an element around inclusion specifically for LGBTIQ plus people. When you think of social compacting and nation building, and you think of government, civil society, and business, and you think of ways that communication can sort of be made better and communication can be more effective, there's an element of distrust. there's an element of distrust throughout, and part of what is frustrating is that often the goals are actually similar. And there's always, if you look for it, and it's an important exercise to be doing all the time in any kind of work that we're doing, across CSOs, business, or CSOs and government, etc. But it's really finding the element of shared value. And so an element of kind of understanding, why does a business exist? They exist to make a profit. Why does a CSO exist? They exist to be advocating for a particular social justice issue. And I think in understanding what the purpose of both is, and understanding how you do those purposes and how you continue your business, there's some commonalities that can be found there. So, for example, and I will zero in specifically on LGBTIQ plus inclusion. It's in the interest of businesses to make sure that their own businesses are inclusive. But it's also in the interest of business to make sure that the environment and the societies that they, and the markets that they operate in are increasingly more inclusive and increasingly more diverse, because it's better for them. And it's better for them in terms of in terms of attracting, and in terms of retaining sort of the best talent that you can possibly get within that particular market. And so with the work that CSOs are doing, understanding that purpose and understanding that that shared value, that shared element, or that commonality of the CSOs are looking for inclusion and diversity, and this is the work that they're doing. But this can also benefit businesses in what way? And being able to articulate what that common goal is, I think does a lot to address some of the distrust, because at the heart of it, it's really that, there's a problem around distrust, there's a problem around communication, and there's a problem around echo chambers. And once we start to break down those echo chambers and really communicate about, okay, so I'm operating in this market. Let's take Lagos, for example. I'm a multinational company, and I've just opened a branch in Lagos, and I know that the laws are anti-LGBTIQ plus people. They're quite repressive, actually, and I'm quite fearful as a company of doing or saying anything that can put me in trouble with the government, because I still want to operate here and I still want to make a profit in this country. It's important for CSOs to be able to come to the table, because this is the work that is important for CSOs and is important for advocacy work and for moving forward, for moving the needle in terms of policy, to sit down and really use the influence that companies have to be able to say, okay, so we can't change the law of the land, but what can we do within your company? What are the ways in which we can work together to make sure that diversity is important? Because if diversity is important in the UK or in South Africa, and you've explicitly mentioned this, it should be important in Nairobi as well, and in Lagos as well. So it's important to find common ways of kind of speaking and understanding what the shared value is and what the shared element is in work that is already continuing. I think a lot of what happens in the relations, specifically with CSOs and businesses, is that there's a very, almost an element of within the business world, it's thought of as charity, as doing charity work or as doing CSR work in a lot of companies. And so doing the work to actually change that culture and to change that thinking, that there's a goal in mind that everyone can benefit from, including the businesses, and how do we work better together? And how do we not think of working together with CSOs as charitable work or CSR work, corporate social responsibility work? And how do we think of it as how do we embed it into our business and into our business model and into the way that we work? And how do we find common advantages, common benefits that we can both work through to? Because that makes it a lot more sustainable. Once there's a common goal and once there's a shared value, it's a lot more sustainable, because nobody has to go out of their way or out of their normal kind of business that they're doing to make sure that we are advancing a particular social justice goal.
The Other Foundation is a first of its kind African trust. We are not your everyday funder. We are a community foundation, and we see ourselves as part of the community, as change agents as much as the people that we work for are change agents. To do this, a big part of it is research. You can't act without research, without understanding the environment you work with and what has worked in that environment. One of the key findings from these papers and from other papers our grantees are doing is a lot of change that happens in Southern Africa is moved by two factors. The first one is families. People's networks, their family networks, whether it's close family or distant family, and as you penetrate into family structures, either through parents of LGBTI people telling their stories, what you see is that those parents' advocacy in the church, those parents' advocacy in traditional spaces, and even those parents' advocacy in political spaces opens up the conversation, brings a lot more people into the conversation, and that it shifts the conversation away from sex, which can be quite taboo to talk about, and it shifts it far more towards family, acceptance, tolerance, togetherness. And those are the values that this region holds dearly, and shifting our narrative of LGBTI advocacy to fit with those values is going to be key in the coming decade in how we transform the societies that we live in. Whether we like it or not, global corporations, businesses, multinationals are a huge part of our societies, our economies, our politics, and ensuring that the change we're looking for is happening in those spaces too is critically important. Ways we found that change can happen in those spaces is affinity groups. So groups of LGBTI people and their allies coming together, discussing the organization, the company, the policies, the work they do, how they can advocate within the company, within the business for that kind of change. Businesses becoming diverse, businesses leaning into more diversity, not just racial diversity or gender diversity, but LGBTI diversity, are able to then also benefit from the society, the diverse society we live in. We know, for instance, that the Pink Rand, not only the money the LGBTI community has to spend, but the influence they have on spending is very high. It matches up with the rest of the world, and as more and more groups seek to talk to that community, so too do they see the benefits of it. Our scope of research that we've done has not only looked at these sort of smaller niche spaces where advocacy can be very effective, like the family, like business, like the media, but it's also looked at scoping Southern Africa generally, seeing what organizations are working where and what they're working on, looking at what policies are available for LGBTI people to work with and what policies are working against them. The digital space is opening up, which has opened up a whole new spectrum of research that looks at how not only safe LGBTI people are online, but also what opportunities there are as the online space increases for advocacy and visibility.
LGBT people in West Africa continue to face violence and discrimination because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. In Nigeria, for instance, a lot of people are beaten up, they face blackmail, and they are denied their basic human rights because of the existence of the law that criminalizes LGBT people for their existence and who they are. In Ghana, there's a law that has been proposed to further criminalize LGBT people as against the law that exists that only criminalizes sexual activity of gay men. So now a person cannot hold themselves up as LGBT or as a gay, lesbian or bisexual according to the law that has been proposed. If anyone identifies or talks about themselves as a gay person, they could be imprisoned for up to 5 years, according to the new law that has been proposed. In French countries, people still face violence, though it is not as prominent as in British colonized countries. There are still issues of violence and discrimination against people in other countries across West Africa. It's important that organizations and businesses create a safe environment for every individual in the organization to feel safe and comfortable to produce more and give up their best. Ensuring inclusion, diversity, and equity for every individual is therefore very key, especially for LGBT people who face all forms of discrimination in the workplace because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. A gay man who comes to work in the morning, who is laughed at, teased, and looked at in certain ways, does not help such an individual to give up their best. A lesbian woman who is taken out of healthcare on certain maternity leave and other issues that affect women is not a key thing that will help them produce of their best. Everyone needs to be included. Diversity needs to be promoted and ensure that there's equity, that everybody receives what is accorded to them as individuals and as who they are within the workplace. To ensure that we all give up our best as individuals, let's ensure that there's inclusion, there is diversity, and there's equity in the workplace. Companies must create a safe space for employees to work and give off their best as individuals. It's important that we promote diversity, inclusion, and equity within our workplaces. Diversity comes in when we ensure that every individual is involved in one way or the another in decision making. The only way people can give off their best is if they feel included and they feel represented in the organizations. So therefore important that organizations put in place policies, systems, structures, and things that help people to feel important, feel involved, and feel that they are represented in the workplace. When somebody comes to the workplace and the person sees that there are intentional means for them to feel involved, then that is inclusion. Businesses can create a safe environment for LGBT individuals to come in, even if the community does not support them as LGBT people. And this would help LGBT people when they come to the workplace to feel safe and secured and give up their best. Businesses can also help by contributing to the work of LGBT advocates in their communities. Let's find out what work is being done by LGBT people and see how we can contribute through funding, through technical support, and through visibility. It's important also that we contribute to the lobbying process as businesses. What is happening in the country, businesses can also contribute to the discussion of laws, policies, by talking to parliamentarians and people they work with within their workspaces. Including LGBTI-owned businesses help to contribute to LGBTI empowerment and ensure that LGBTI people are involved in the broader economic empowerment process. This also helps to ensure that LGBTI people are able to contribute to the welfare of their families and their friends and the people who depend on them.
To look at the state of LGBTI rights in the MENA region, it's important to kind of mention the fact that 71 countries worldwide still criminalize homosexuality. Egypt, in the past, has been classified as a country that does not decriminalize LGBT, being LGBTI. But then in 2001, that changed around when laws that were not necessarily explicitly mentioning LGBTI community or homosexuality in particular have been used to persecute gay men. Most recently, there was a case where younger men and women were arrested for raising rainbow flags at a music concert. One of them, Sarah Hagezi, just very recently, not too long back, has unfortunately taken her life. If we look at local companies, I would say LGBTI inclusion is non-existent in workplaces because there's no legislation to protect LGBTI people from discrimination. The laws, make it clear that LGBTI people have no rights and are not necessarily accepted, and hence it does not provide the space for for workplaces to actually do anything about it. Multinationals might be running their campaigns and running their policies and kind of trying to create their employee resource groups that bring people together to discuss LGBTI inclusion and ensure that policies and guidelines, etc., within the company do not discriminate. However, when it comes to the Middle East and North Africa, you have different types of multinationals. Some multinationals that will completely avoid, they will launch an employee resource group and just kind of position it for all countries except within Middle East and North Africa. Others that would make it available for people to access online. And I believe that businesses should at least play the role of reaching out to the LGBTI employees within their organizations, making them feel comfortable, making them feel safe, ensure that they understand that them being themselves will not impact them, neither from from a workplace, in the workplace, and that's what the company can actually control. But that necessarily doesn't happen in most cases. However, companies can even go further, especially companies that have big influence on governments and have the lobbying power to actually support and help LGBTI communities across the region get better treatment and get more breathing space. The whole rhetoric about the anti-sodomy laws or laws that are being used against the LGBTI community are not it's not necessarily very alive in the Middle East, although it is a fact. A lot of those laws are vestiges of the colonial past. In my opinion, it's not necessarily the core of the discourse around the legislation being used. The question will be, rather than changing laws or introducing laws because of the colonial past of the current laws, it would rather be, will they resort to looking at laws that will help them control what they call and what they think is a Western dissemination or the dissemination of Western values. The laws, I don't think, will be changed because of the colonial past. If anything, it will be due to the fear, or at least the expressed fear of dissemination of Western values and leading to a greater acceptance of homogeneity. The younger generation is a lot more vocal, so there's a greater need to control how the younger generation thinks, how the younger generation feels about certain issues. I would say the younger generation is a lot more unstoppable than before. So there is that pressure to do anything possible to keep that younger generation under control. Things are difficult for the LGBTI community in the Middle East and North Africa. They continue to be difficult because we do have draconian laws that actually deprive them of their basic rights. So that is a fact. Is there change? Yes. There is change not because there's a active movement within the society at large, but because of small pockets of activism that happen online or might happen from outside of the borders of the countries of the Middle East and North Africa themselves. And that change is fueled by globalization, is fueled by the amazing amount of connectedness that we have at this point in time.